The rain fell in relentless sheets, soaking through Lucas's tattered clothes as he stood near the bustling street corner. He clenched his fists to stop his hands from trembling, though it wasn't just the cold that made him shake. The city was alive with people rushing past him, umbrellas bobbing above their heads, their chatter and laughter echoing through the damp air. No one saw him. No one cared. Lucas, barely 13, stood apart from the crowd, his face pale and hollow. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a relentless reminder that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. His only possessions were the oversized hoodie that hung off his small frame, a pair of shoes too worn to keep out the cold, and a crumpled photo of his mother, his last connection to a life he barely remembered. Through the blur of rain and headlights, he spotted him. Cristiano Ronaldo. The man was unmistakable, walking with an effortless confidence that turned heads. Flanked by an entourage and dressed in a sleek black coat, Ronaldo moved like royalty, his every step echoing authority. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen Ronaldo on TV, larger than life, a man who inspired millions. For a brief moment, hope flickered in Lucas's chest. Could this man, so powerful and admired, spare something as small as $1? Gathering what little courage he had left, Lucas stepped forward, his voice barely audible. "Sir, can you give me $1? Ronaldo turned, his piercing eyes meeting Lucas's. For a fleeting moment, Lucas thought he saw something, sympathy, perhaps, or curiosity. But before he could hope, the moment shattered. A man from Ronaldo's entourage stepped forward, shielding the football star as if Lucas were a threat. "Get lost, kid," the man snapped, his tone cold and dismissive. Lucas's heart sank. He wasn't expecting a grand gesture, but he hadn't expected this, rejection so blunt, so humiliating. The group began to move, their laughter rising above the rain. Ronaldo didn't look back. He didn't say a word. The boy stood frozen, his soaked shoes sinking into the puddles below. Tears blurred his vision as he watched the man disappear into the crowd. The rain mingled with the salty streaks on his cheeks, but Lucas made no effort to wipe them away. He felt small, invisible, like the world had confirmed what he already knew: he didn't matter. That night, Lucas wandered aimlessly through the city. The streets, alive with neon lights and distant music, felt colder than ever. He found shelter under a bridge, where other homeless men sat huddled in makeshift camps. They barely acknowledged him, he was just another lost soul. Lucas curled up against the concrete wall, clutching his knees to his chest. He thought of his mother, her gentle voice telling him bedtime stories, her hands combing through his hair. She had been everything to him, his shield against the harshness of the world. But cancer had stolen her, leaving him to navigate a life that seemed determined to break him. His father had been no better. Lucas still remembered the day he was sent to live with him after his mother's death. The man had looked at him with disdain, as if Lucas were a burden he couldn't wait to discard. Within weeks, he was gone, leaving Lucas alone in a run-down apartment until child services intervened. The foster homes that followed were no kinder. By the time Lucas ended up on the streets, he had learned not to expect kindness from anyone. He had become an expert at blending into the background, avoiding trouble while scavenging what he could to survive. But even that was growing harder. The city had a way of chewing people up and spitting them out, and Lucas felt like he was reaching his breaking point. The next morning, Lucas woke to the sound of traffic rumbling overhead. His stomach growled, and his limbs ached from the cold. He needed food, but the thought of begging again filled him with dread. Still, he had no choice. As he wandered the streets, he passed a bakery with its door slightly ajar. The scent of fresh bread wafted out, making his stomach churn with longing. He stood outside for what felt like hours, debating whether to ask for a scrap, when a woman inside noticed him. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice kind but cautious. Lucas nodded, his throat tight with shame. The woman handed him a small loaf of bread, her smile warm but fleeting. "Take care of yourself," she said before disappearing back inside. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark something in Lucas, a reminder that not everyone in the world was cruel. As he ate, he thought about Ronaldo. The man had seemed so untouchable, so far removed from the reality Lucas lived every day. And yet, for all his fame and fortune, Ronaldo hadn't spared him even a word. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas continued to scrape by. One evening, as he wandered near the stadium where Ronaldo's team was playing, he noticed a crowd gathering. Fans were chanting, their energy palpable. Lucas lingered on the outskirts, watching as the star player emerged to cheers and flashing cameras. Suddenly, a commotion broke out. A young girl had fallen near the crowd, her cries drowned out by the noise. Without thinking, Lucas rushed forward, helping her to her feet. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Ronaldo, who had witnessed the scene, approached, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he truly looked at Lucas, not as a nuisance, but as a person. The boy stood his ground, his face a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "I've seen you before," Ronaldo said, his tone softer than Lucas expected. Lucas hesitated, unsure whether to speak. "I asked you for $1 once," he finally said. "You didn't answer." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ronaldo's entourage shifted uncomfortably, but the footballer didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out not $1, but a stack of bills. "This isn't just for you," Ronaldo said. "It's for every time someone ignored you when you needed help." Lucas held the stack of bills in his trembling hands, unsure whether to feel gratitude, shame, or anger. He looked up at Ronaldo, whose face showed an uncharacteristic softness. But the moment felt incomplete. This wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about something Lucas had longed for his entire life, acknowledgement. And now that he had it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Thank you," Lucas said quietly, his voice laced with both sincerity and hesitation. Ronaldo nodded but said nothing more. His entourage ushered him away, their hurried steps and hushed voices pulling him back into the world of flashing cameras and adoring fans. Lucas stood there, the crowd thinning around him, the bills in his hand feeling heavier than they should. He walked away from the stadium, the noise of the game fading into the distance. For the first time in years, he had enough money to change his circumstances. But change, he realized, required more than cash. It required courage, effort, and a belief in himself, something he had buried beneath years of rejection and despair. Lucas found his way to a shelter on the edge of the city, a place he had avoided in the past out of pride. The building was old but welcoming, its worn sign reading "Second Chances Home." He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Would they judge him? Would they turn him away, like so many others had? Summoning all the courage he had, he pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth of the space was almost overwhelming. The smell of soup wafted through the air, and the chatter of other residents filled the room. A woman behind a desk looked up and smiled. She was in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. Lucas hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. I need a place to stay." Her smile widened. "You've come to the right place. Let's get you settled." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas was met with kindness that didn't come with strings attached. The woman, whose name was Clara, showed him to a small room with a cot, a blanket, and a desk. It wasn't much, but to Lucas, it felt like a palace. The shelter wasn't just a place to sleep, it became a place of healing. Lucas attended group meetings where others shared their stories of hardship and survival. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. Others had faced pain and rejection too, yet they were still fighting, still striving for something better. One evening, Clara handed him a pamphlet for a local program that helped homeless youth return to school. "I think you do well here," she said, her tone encouraging but not pushy. Lucas looked at the pamphlet, the words blurring slightly as tears filled his eyes. No one had believed in him like this before, not since his mother. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Returning to school was daunting. Lucas was years behind his peers, and the first few weeks were filled with frustration and self-doubt. But he pushed through, fueled by a determination he hadn't realized he possessed. Every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the way Ronaldo had looked at him, the way the world had dismissed him. He wanted to prove them all wrong, not for their sake, but for his own. As Lucas progressed in school, he discovered a talent he hadn't known he had: writing. His essays about life on the streets and the resilience of the human spirit caught the attention of his teachers, who encouraged him to keep going. One of them, Mr. Carter, took a special interest in him. "Your words have power, Lucas," Mr. Carter said one afternoon, handing back an essay covered in glowing comments. "You can use them to change the world." Lucas felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: pride. For so long, he had believed he was invisible, that his voice didn't matter. But now, he began to see that his story could be a source of strength, not just for himself but for others. As the years went by, Lucas transformed his pain into purpose. He started volunteering at the same shelter that had saved him, mentoring younger kids who were going through the same struggles he had faced. He listened to their stories, offering them the support and encouragement he had so desperately needed. One evening, while helping a boy who reminded him of his younger self, Lucas realized something profound. He no longer felt anger or resentment toward the people who had hurt him. They had shaped him, yes, but they didn't define him. He had found his strength not in spite of his struggles, but because of them. Years later, Lucas found himself standing on a stage, addressing a room full of people at a charity gala for homeless youth. His story had gained attention, and his words had inspired countless others to see the humanity in those society often overlooked. As he spoke, his eyes scanned the crowd and landed on a familiar face: Cristiano Ronaldo. The football star sat in the audience, his expression a mixture of pride and something else Lucas couldn't quite place. After the event, Ronaldo approached him. "You've come a long way," Ronaldo said, extending a hand. Lucas shook it, his grip firm but calm. "I had to," he replied. "I couldn't let the world win." Ronaldo smiled, but there was a hint of regret in his eyes. "I'm glad I could help, even in a small way." Lucas nodded. "You did. But what helped me most was realizing I could help myself." Ronaldo didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Lucas walked away, his heart lighter than it had ever been. He didn't need Ronaldo's validation anymore. He had found his own worth, and no one could take that away. Lucas stepped off the stage, his heart pounding with a mix of exhilaration and calm. The applause still echoed in his ears, but it wasn't the sound of clapping hands that gave him peace, it was the knowledge that he had spoken his truth, and it had been heard. For so long, his story had been a silent scream, buried under layers of pain and rejection. But now, standing before hundreds of people, he had shared it openly, not for pity, but as a testament to resilience. As he moved through the crowd, people stopped him to shake his hand, their faces filled with admiration and gratitude. He smiled at each of them, offering quiet thanks, but his focus remained clear. This wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about making a difference, about showing others that even the darkest nights could lead to brighter days. When Ronaldo approached him after the event, Lucas had felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. The man who had once walked away from him, who had represented everything Lucas despised about the world's indifference, now stood before him, humbled. It was a strange moment, one that might have once filled Lucas with anger or bitterness. But instead, he felt only calm. After their brief exchange, Lucas watched Ronaldo leave, the football star walking alone through the crowd. Lucas had learned that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or excusing the pain, it was about freeing himself from its weight. Ronaldo had played a small role in his journey, but Lucas's transformation was entirely his own. That evening, Lucas returned to the shelter where he now worked as a mentor. The building was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound in the empty halls. He walked into his office, a small room with a single desk and a wall covered in photographs. Each picture told a story, kids he had helped, moments of triumph, and milestones reached. In the center of it all was a photo of his mother, smiling warmly, her eyes filled with the kind of love that had always made Lucas feel invincible. He sat down at his desk, running his fingers over the edges of the photo. "I did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice steady but soft. "I made it." The journey had been far from easy. There were nights when he still woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by memories of hunger, fear, and loneliness. But those memories no longer consumed him. They were scars, not wounds, and they reminded him of the strength he had discovered within himself. The next day, Lucas began preparations for a new initiative. He had been working on a program to help homeless youth transition into stable housing and education, using his own experiences to shape the project. It was ambitious, and funding was tight, but Lucas was determined. He reached out to contacts he had made over the years, leveraging every connection and resource he had. Weeks later, the program launched, and the response was overwhelming. Dozens of young people signed up, their faces a mix of hope and hesitation. Lucas greeted each one personally, sharing pieces of his story to put them at ease. He saw himself in their eyes, the same fear, the same uncertainty, and he vowed to be the support they needed, the support he had once longed for. One evening, as Lucas walked through the shelter's common area, he noticed a boy sitting alone in a corner, his knees drawn to his chest. The boy couldn't have been older than 10, his face gaunt and his clothes hanging loosely off his small frame. Lucas approached him slowly, crouching down to meet his gaze. "Hey," Lucas said gently. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, his eyes weary. "Mateo," he murmured. Lucas offered a warm smile. "It's nice to meet you, Mateo. Are you hungry?" The boy nodded hesitantly. Lucas stood and extended a hand. "Come on, let's get you something to eat." As they walked to the kitchen, Lucas felt a sense of déjà vu. Mateo reminded him so much of himself, lost, scared, and searching for something to hold on to. But this time, Lucas wasn't the boy in need. He was the one offering the hand, the one creating the opportunity. Days turned into weeks, and Mateo began to open up. Lucas learned that the boy had been abandoned by his parents and had been living on the streets for months. It was a story Lucas knew all too well, and he made it his mission to help Mateo find stability. Through Lucas's guidance, Mateo started attending school, slowly regaining the confidence and hope he had lost. One evening, as Mateo worked on a drawing in the shelter's activity room, he looked up at Lucas and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." The words hit Lucas harder than he expected, filling him with a profound sense of purpose. "You'll be even better," Lucas replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "I believe in you." As Lucas left the shelter that night, he looked up at the stars, their light piercing through the darkness of the city sky. He thought about the boy he had been, the pain he had endured, and the man he had become. Life had tested him in ways he wouldn't wish on anyone, but it had also given him the strength to rise above it. Lucas no longer needed the validation of the world, nor did he seek revenge against those who had wronged him. His life was his own, and he had filled it with meaning, love, and hope. And as he walked home, the city alive with its usual chaos, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Lucas's life had taken a turn he never anticipated. For years, he had been the pillar of strength for others, the beacon of hope for the youth he mentored and the community he served. But even the strongest pillars can crack under the weight of unforeseen burdens. It started small: missed deadlines, restless nights, and an inexplicable heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He chalked it up to stress, but deep down, he knew something was unraveling. The first blow came from the person he thought would be his partner for life, Elena. She had entered his world like a burst of sunlight, her vibrant energy complementing his calm, steady demeanor. They met at a fundraising event for the shelter, and it didn't take long for Lucas to fall in love. She seemed to understand his pain, his past, and his relentless drive to help others. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream of a future that wasn't solely about survival. Their wedding was simple but beautiful. The shelter kids, his second family, decorated the space with handmade crafts, and the community came together to celebrate a love story that seemed destined for success. But the cracks began to show almost immediately after the honeymoon. Elena, who had admired Lucas's dedication from a distance, began to resent it up close. "You're never here," she said one evening, her voice trembling with frustration. "You spend more time with those kids than with me. I feel like I'm married to a ghost." Lucas tried to explain, to make her see that his work wasn't just a job, it was his purpose. "Elena, this isn't just about me. These kids need someone to believe in them." "And what about me, Lucas?" she shot back, her eyes brimming with tears. "Don't I deserve to be a priority too?" The arguments became more frequent, each one eroding the foundation of their relationship. Lucas found himself torn between the life he had built and the love he desperately wanted to save. But the final straw came on a night that Lucas would never forget. It was late, and Lucas had just returned home from a crisis at the shelter. A teenager, desperate and scared, had threatened to run away, and Lucas had spent hours talking him down. When he walked through the door, exhausted but relieved, he found Elena sitting at the dining table with a suitcase by her side. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice hollow. "I love you, Lucas, but I can't keep competing with your past, your pain, and your need to fix everyone else. I need someone who can be present, and that's not you." Lucas froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but he could see the resolve in her eyes. She was done. As Elena walked out the door, Lucas felt a part of himself leave with her. He sat at the table for hours, staring at the empty chair across from him. For the first time in years, he felt truly alone. The fallout didn't end there. Word of his crumbling marriage spread through the community, and while most offered sympathy, others were less kind. Whispers began to circulate, questions about whether Lucas was spreading himself too thin, whether he was capable of maintaining the balance needed to lead the shelter. A board member even suggested stepping in to reevaluate leadership roles, a veiled threat that stung more than Lucas wanted to admit. At the same time, the shelter faced financial challenges that threatened to undo years of progress. A promised grant fell through, leaving a massive hole in their budget. Lucas worked tirelessly to keep the doors open, but the pressure mounted. Staff members grew anxious, and some even left, seeking stability elsewhere. The kids he had dedicated his life to started sensing the tension, their trust in him wavering. One night, after yet another long day of juggling responsibilities, Lucas returned to his empty apartment and collapsed onto the couch. The silence was deafening, the kind that allowed every doubt and fear to creep in. He thought about his mother, about how she had carried so much alone before the cancer took her. He thought about his younger self, hungry and shivering on the streets, and wondered if he had truly escaped that version of himself, or if he was just delaying the inevitable. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. It was a message from one of the older boys at the shelter, a kid Lucas had mentored for years. "Hey, Lucas. Can we talk? I'm thinking of leaving. I don't think I belong here anymore." Lucas stared at the screen, his heart sinking. He wanted to reply, to say the right thing, but his hands felt heavy, as if the weight of everything had finally paralyzed him. He placed the phone down and leaned back, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The boy's message felt like a metaphor for his own life, a sense of belonging slipping through his fingers. The next morning, Lucas forced himself to get up and return to the shelter. But as he walked through the doors, he was met with another blow. A notice was pinned to the bulletin board near his office. The landlord had increased the rent on the building, effective immediately. It was a cost they couldn't afford, not with the budget already stretched thin. Lucas stood there, his mind racing with the implications. The shelter, the one place that had been his sanctuary and his mission, was now at risk of closing. And for the first time in years, Lucas felt the sting of hopelessness return, a dark and familiar shadow whispering in his ear. As the weight of everything bore down on him, Lucas realized he was at a crossroads. He had spent his entire life fighting against the odds, but this time, the odds felt insurmountable. And for the first time, he wondered if he had the strength to keep going. Lucas sat in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of everything threatening to crush him. The shelter's rent increase, the departure of staff, the boy's text message, and Elena's absence, it all swirled in his mind like a storm he couldn't outrun. He stared at the photo of his mother on the small table beside him, her warm smile frozen in time. He had spent his entire life fighting, yet here he was, exhausted and unsure if he had anything left to give. But then, something inside him stirred. It wasn't a surge of energy or clarity, it was small, almost imperceptible, like the faint glow of a candle in the dark. He remembered his mother's voice, the words she used to say when life felt impossible. "You can't control what life takes from you, but you can choose what you give back." Lucas looked around the room. It was empty, silent, but it wasn't hopeless. Not yet. He reached for his phone and opened the message from the boy at the shelter. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he began to type. "You belong here more than you know. Don't let the hard days make you forget why you started. Let's talk tomorrow. I'm here for you." He hit send, his heart heavy but determined. It was a small act, but it reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about perfection, or always being strong, it was about showing up, even when it felt impossible. The next morning, Lucas walked into the shelter with a newfound resolve. The building was still facing challenges, the budget was still a mess, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He gathered the staff and volunteers in the common area, their faces a mix of exhaustion and worry. "We've faced hard times before," Lucas began, his voice steady. "And we've made it through because we believed in what we're doing here. This place isn't just a shelter, it's a home, a second chance, a place where people find hope when they have none. And I'm not ready to let that go." He paused, scanning their faces. "We can do this, but I can't do it alone. I need each of you, your ideas, your energy, your belief. Let's fight for this place, together." The room was silent for a moment, and then Clara, the shelter's longest-serving volunteer, stepped forward. "We're with you, Lucas. Whatever it takes." From that moment, the tide began to turn. Lucas and his team launched a campaign to save the shelter, reaching out to the community, local businesses, and even former residents. They shared stories of resilience, of lives transformed, of kids who had found their way because the shelter had been there for them. Slowly but surely, Donations began to trickle in. One evening, as Lucas was preparing to leave, he received an unexpected call. It was from Elena. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "I saw the campaign," she said. "What you're doing, it's incredible." Lucas's heart ached at the sound of her voice, but he didn't let it cloud his focus. "Thank you," he replied simply. "This place means everything to me." There was a pause on the line. "I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you, Lucas. Truly." When the call ended, Lucas felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. Elena's pride meant something, but it wasn't what defined him. He had learned to carry his own validation, to find strength within himself. Weeks later, the campaign reached its climax. Donations flooded in, and the shelter not only met its financial needs but surpassed them. With the extra funds, they expanded their programs, offering job training, mental health services, and educational support for the kids who needed it most. The boy who had texted Lucas about leaving decided to stay, eventually becoming one of the shelter's youth leaders. One evening, after the shelter's annual community dinner, Lucas stood outside, looking up at the stars. Clara approached him, her warm smile breaking the silence. "You did it, Lucas," she said. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "We did it. Together." As Clara walked back inside, Lucas stayed a moment longer, reflecting on everything, the pain, the losses, the moments when he thought he couldn't go on. He realized something profound: the struggles hadn't broken him, they had shaped him. Every rejection, every tear, every setback had been a step on the path to this moment. Lucas had found his purpose not in spite of his pain, but through it. He had learned that strength wasn't about never falling, it was about always getting back up. And as he stood there, feeling the cool night air on his face, he knew that no matter what the future held, he was ready. Because he had already won the greatest battle of all, the battle to believe in himself.